The forward operating base in Afghanistan felt like a pressure cooker in the desert heat. But today, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising relief and chaos in equal measure. Chief Warrant Officer Rebecca Hayes adjusted her flight helmet. As she walked the perimeter of her assigned aircraft, a battle-scarred UH-60 Blackhawk that had seen better decades. The helicopter bore the wounds of countless missions, faded paint peeling at the edges, rivets replaced with field repairs, and a tail rotor that hummed with a slight vibration that made newer pilots nervous. But Rebecca knew every sound, every shake, every quirk of this machine like she knew her own heartbeat. She'd inherited it from her father, also a pilot, whose handwritten notes still filled the margins of the flight manual tucked beside her. "Seat, Hayes." Major Bradley Thompson's voice cut across the tarmac like a whip crack. The commanding officer approached with his usual swagger, mirrored aviators reflecting the darkening sky. Behind him trailed his inner circle, Captain Jake Morrison and Lieutenant Danny Rodriguez, both pilots of the squadron's newest, most pristine Blackhawks. Rebecca straightened, saluting crisply. "Yes, sir." Thompson's gaze swept over her helicopter with undisguised disdain. "That relic of yours is going back on standby status. We've got a high-priority rescue mission coming up, and I need birds I can count on, not museum pieces." The words stung, but Rebecca kept her expression neutral. She'd heard variations of this speech for months. Ever since Thompson had taken command 6 months ago, he'd made it clear that he preferred his Golden Boys and their shiny new aircraft over what he called legacy equipment. Captain Morrison snickered, loud enough for everyone to hear. That things held together with duct tape and prayers. Surprised it hasn't fallen out of the sky yet. Lieutenant Rodriguez joined in, his voice carrying across the flight line. "Maybe we should retire it to the boneyard where it belongs." Along with pilots who can't keep up with modern warfare, a few nearby ground crew members paused their work, sensing the tension. Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks, but forced herself to respond professionally. "Sir, with respect, this aircraft has completed over 500 combat missions without a single mechanical failure." The maintenance logs show. Thompson held up a hand, cutting her off. "I don't need a history lesson, Hayes. I need results. And results come from reliable equipment and pilots who don't question orders." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a level meant only for her. "You've been coasting on your father's reputation long enough. Time to prove you belong here, or find somewhere else to serve." The mention of her father hit like a physical blow. Colonel Michael Hayes had been a legend in Army aviation, killed in action 2 years ago while flying a rescue mission in similar conditions. Rebecca had requested his old aircraft specifically, had worked twice as hard as anyone else to prove herself worthy of carrying on his legacy. "Understood, sir," she managed, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Thompson nodded curtly and turned to address his favorite pilots. "Morrison, Rodriguez, prep your birds. We've got intelligence on downed personnel in the valley, approximately 30 clicks northeast. Weather's getting rough, but nothing these new Blackhawks can't handle." As the group moved away, their laughter echoing across the flight line, Rebecca stood alone beside her helicopter. She ran her hand along the scarred fuselage, feeling the history embedded in every dent and scratch. The aircraft seemed to hum, with quiet defiance, as if it too had heard the insults and was ready to prove them wrong. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, one of the few people on base who treated Rebecca with genuine respect, approached with a maintenance clipboard. "Don't let them get to you," she said quietly. "Some of us remember what real flying looks like." Rebecca nodded gratefully, but her attention was drawn to the darkening horizon. Storm clouds were building with unusual speed, their edges lit by distant lightning. The wind was picking up, carrying the scent of rain and electricity. "Maria," she said suddenly, Run a full pre-flight check on everything. Every system, every component. You expecting to fly today? Rebecca looked toward the operations tent where Thompson was briefing his chosen pilots. Call it intuition. As if summoned by her words, the first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, dotting the dusty tarmac with dark circles. The storm was coming faster than anyone had predicted, and something in Rebecca's gut told her that before this day was over, her battered Blackhawk would have its chance to prove what both she and her father had always known, that sometimes the oldest birds fly the strongest when the winds grow fierce. The laughter from Thompson's group grew distant as they moved toward their gleaming aircraft. But Rebecca stayed beside her helicopter, watching the storm approach and feeling the electric tension that meant everything was about to change. The mission briefing took place in the ops tent as the first real drops of rain began hammering the canvas roof. Rebecca stood at the back with the other standby pilots, officially present, but clearly not part of the primary plan. Major Thompson dominated the front of the room, pointer in hand as he traced routes on the tactical map. Gentlemen, we have a downed Chinook helicopter with 6 personnel in the Korangal Valley. Intelligence suggests possible hostile activity in the area, but weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Thompson's voice carried the confidence of a man who'd never doubted his own decisions. Primary rescue team will consist of Morrison in Hawk 7, Rodriguez in Hawk 9, and Captain Williams in the Apache for air support. Rebecca studied the weather reports on her tablet, frowning at what she saw. Wind speeds were climbing faster than predicted, and the storm system showed signs of severe turbulence that could ground aircraft within hours. She raised her hand. Tentatively, "Sir, the meteorological data shows wind shear levels approaching dangerous thresholds. Perhaps we should consider haze." Thompson's voice cut through the tent like a blade. "Did I ask for input from the peanut gallery?" Suppressed chuckles rippled through the room. Morrison leaned back in his chair with a smirk. "Maybe she's worried her antique can't handle a little wind. At least I know my aircraft's limitations," Rebecca replied, her professional composure cracking slightly. "These weather patterns are exactly what grounded 3 helicopters last month in Helmand Province. The atmospheric pressure readings. Enough." Thompson slammed his pointer down on the table. "This is exactly the kind of overcautious thinking that gets people killed. While you're studying weather reports, there are soldiers dying in that valley." Captain Williams, the Apache pilot, shifted uncomfortably. Unlike the others, he'd flown with Rebecca before and respected her expertise. "Major, Hayes has a point about the weather. Maybe we should consider a delayed launch until—" Thompson's face flushed red. "Are you questioning my command decision, Captain?" "No, sir, but then we proceed as planned." "Hayes, since you're so concerned about weather patterns, you can stay here and monitor conditions from the comfort of the operations center. Maybe file some paperwork while you're at it." The dismissal was meant to humiliate, and it worked. Rebecca felt every eye in the tent watching her reaction. Some faces showed sympathy, others barely concealed amusement. She'd been publicly sidelined, her expertise dismissed in front of her peers. "Yes, sir," she said quietly, gathering her materials. As she moved toward the exit, she heard Morrison's stage whisper, "Probably for the best. Last thing we need is her dad's ghost riding along on this one." The comment about her father stopped her cold. Rebecca turned slowly, her eyes finding Morrison's smug face. "What did you say?" The tent fell silent except for the increasing drum of rain on canvas. Morrison had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, but Thompson stepped forward before he could respond. "Problem, Hayes?" Rebecca measured her words carefully. "No, sir, no problem." But as she left the tent, her hands were shaking not with fear, but with barely controlled anger. Behind her, she heard Thompson's voice resume briefing his team, dismissing her concerns about weather conditions that were worsening by the minute. Outside, The storm was building with frightening speed. What had been scattered drops an hour ago was now a steady downpour, and the wind carried an edge that made the base's structures creak and groan. Rebecca hurried to her helicopter, where Sergeant Gonzalez was completing the pre-flight inspection. "How'd the briefing go?" Maria asked, though Rebecca's expression probably told the story. "They're launching in 2 hours, right into the worst of it." Rebecca pulled out her tablet, showing Maria the updated weather data. "Look at these wind patterns. There's going to be severe downdrafts in the valley, possibly microbursts. The visibility is going to be near zero." Maria studied the screen, her experienced eye reading the data with growing concern. "This looks like suicide weather for a rescue mission." "That's what I tried to tell them." Rebecca looked toward the ops tent, where she could see Thompson's silhouette gesturing at the map. "But apparently, I'm just being overcautious." As if to emphasize the point, a particularly strong gust of wind rocked both women on their feet. In the distance, one of the newer Blackhawks shifted on its tie-downs, the aircraft straining against the securing cables. "Rebecca," Maria said quietly, using her first name instead of rank, something she only did when speaking as a friend rather than a subordinate. "I've been doing this for 15 years. I've seen storms that looked half this bad ground entire squadrons for days. If they launch into this—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Both women understood the implications. Rebecca stood in the rain, water running off her flight suit, watching the storm intensify while somewhere in the valley, 6 soldiers waited for rescue that might never come, not because it was impossible, but because pride and prejudice had replaced good judgment. The storm was about to teach Major Thompson a lesson about the difference between confidence and competence. Rebecca only hoped the price wouldn't be paid in blood by the soldiers counting on them to bring them home. 2 hours later, Rebecca stood in the operations center watching 3 blips on the radar screen disappear into the storm-shrouded valley. The radio chatter had started confident and professional, but even through the static, she could hear the strain creeping into the pilots' voices as they encountered conditions worse than anyone had predicted. Hawk 7 experiencing severe turbulence. Morrison's voice crackled through the speakers. Visibility near zero. Recommend. The transmission cut to static. Major Thompson stood beside her, his earlier confidence wavering as he watched his hand-picked team struggle against nature's fury. Weather station. Give me updated conditions in the valley. The meteorologist, a nervous young airman named Patterson, consulted his instruments with shaking hands. Sir, wind speeds are now gusting to 75 knots, with severe downdrafts and microbursts. The storm system has intensified beyond all projections. Rebecca bit her tongue, remembering her earlier warnings that had been so publicly dismissed. Beside her, Captain Williams monitored the Apache's feed, but even the attack helicopter's advanced systems were struggling with the conditions. Hawk 9 to base. We've lost visual contact with the crash site. Rodriguez's voice was tight with stress. Recommend we abort, and another burst of static swallowed his transmission. Thompson grabbed the radio microphone. Negative, Hawk 9. Continue mission. You have soldiers depending on you. Rebecca couldn't stay silent any longer. Sir, they're flying blind in conditions that could down their aircraft. Perhaps we should consider. Hayes, I told you to monitor, not comment. Thompson's face was flushed, but she could see doubt creeping into his eyes. My pilots can handle this. As if to contradict him, the radio erupted with urgent chatter. Mayday! Mayday! Hawk 7 taking fire. We're hit. The operations center fell silent except for the hiss of static. Rebecca watched Thompson's face go pale as the reality of the situation hit him. His golden boys were in serious trouble, and his pride had put them there. Apache 6, can you provide support? Thompson's voice had lost its earlier bravado. Captain Williams shook his head grimly. Negative, sir. I can barely maintain controlled flight in these conditions. The downdrafts are unlike anything I've encountered. More static burst from the speakers, followed by Morrison's strained voice. Base, Hawk 7 is going down. Repeat, we are going down. Engine failure, attempting emergency landing. The transmission ended abruptly. On the radar screen, one of the 3 blips flickered and disappeared. Thompson stared at the screen in horror. In the space of 2 hours, his perfect mission had become a disaster. One helicopter down, the other struggling to survive, and no way to mount an effective rescue in the current conditions. Sir, Rebecca said quietly, my aircraft is still available. Thompson turned to her, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. Your helicopter? In these conditions? You said yourself the weather was too dangerous. I said it was dangerous for a standard approach, Rebecca replied. But there are ways to fly in weather like this if you know the aircraft and the terrain. Well enough. Sergeant Gonzalez appeared in the doorway, rain dripping from her poncho. Ma'am, your bird is fully prepped and ready. All systems green. Thompson looked between Rebecca and the radar screen where his remaining pilot's blips were struggling against the storm. His carefully constructed world of favorites and prejudices was crumbling around him, and he was faced with a choice that his pride fought against making. The conditions are impossible, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. For some aircraft, yes, Rebecca agreed. But my Black Hawk has been through worse. And unlike your pilots, I've studied this valley for months. I know every ridge, every wing pattern, every approach route. Another burst of static from the radio. Base, this is Hawk 9. I've lost hydraulics, attempting emergency landing near the crash site. Now 2 of Thompson's 3 aircraft were down, and the third was struggling to stay airborne. The soldiers they'd originally come to rescue were still waiting, and now 9 more personnel needed immediate extraction before the storm claimed more lives. Thompson stood frozen, his world of certainties shattered by the reality unfolding before him. In the background, meteorologist Patterson was updating the weather projections, each report worse than the last. The storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it was still intensifying. Rebecca stepped closer to the radio console. Sir, every minute we delay puts more lives at risk. That valley is going to be inaccessible for hours once this storm peaks. Thompson looked at her, really looked at her, for perhaps the first time since taking command. He saw not the object of his prejudice, but a pilot offering to fly into hell itself to save his people. The weight of command, of responsibility for the lives of his aircrews finally broke through his stubborn pride. But even as doubt crept across his features, Rebecca could see him struggling with the admission that he'd been wrong, that the pilot and aircraft he'd dismissed might be their only hope. The storm raged outside, indifferent to human pride and prejudice, while in the operations center, a moment of truth approached that would test more than flying skill. It would test character itself. The breaking point came at 1847 hours, when Captain Williams' Apache went silent mid-transmission. The last anyone heard was his calm, professional voice saying, Base, I'm losing it, before static swallowed everything. Thompson stared at the radar screen where all 3 of his aircraft had vanished from view. 15 soldiers were now stranded in a valley that was becoming increasingly inaccessible with each passing minute. The storm showed no mercy, and neither did the weight of command crushing down on him. Sir, the radio operator said quietly, I'm not getting any response from any of our aircraft. The operations center fell into a silence broken only by the howling wind outside and the steady patter of rain on the roof. Rebecca watched Thompson's face cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally, the terrible recognition of his failure. His golden boys, his perfect aircraft, his flawless plan, all of it lay shattered in a valley 30 kilometers away. Status. Report, Thompson said, his voice barely above a whisper. Meteorologist Patterson consulted his instruments with hands that trembled slightly. "Sir, the storm has reached Category 4 intensity. Wind speeds are sustained at 90 knots with gusts over 100. The eye wall is directly over the valley now." Thompson closed his eyes. When he opened them, Rebecca saw something she'd never seen before in the man: genuine fear. Not for himself, but for the 15 souls depending on him to bring them home. "Sir," Rebecca said, stepping forward, "I need to speak with you privately." Thompson nodded mechanically and followed her to a corner of the operations center, away from the other personnel. For a moment, they stood there listening to the storm's fury, both understanding the magnitude of what had happened. "I was wrong," Thompson said suddenly, the words seeming to cost him physically. "About the weather, about the mission, about ... He gestured vaguely toward Rebecca. "About everything." Rebecca could have felt vindicated, could have pressed her advantage, but looking at the broken man before her, she felt only the urgent need to focus on what mattered now. "Sir, we can discuss that later. Right now, I need your permission to launch." Thompson looked at her as if she'd suggested flying to the moon. "Rebecca, those are the worst conditions I've ever seen. 3 of our most advanced aircraft had just disappeared into that storm." It was the first time he'd used her first name, and somehow that small gesture of respect meant more than any formal apology could have. But Rebecca pressed on. "My aircraft is different. It's been modified with weather radar systems from my toll. Father's era systems that modern pilots don't trust, but that were specifically designed for extreme conditions. And I know that valley better than anyone." Thompson shook his head. "It's suicide. I can't ask you to." "You're not asking, sir. I'm volunteering." Through the operations center window, they could see her battered Blackhawk sitting on the tarmac, rain streaming off its scarred hull. Where the newer aircraft had looked sleek and modern, hers looked like what it was, a combat veteran that had survived because it was built to endure, not to impress. Sergeant Gonzalez appeared at Rebecca's elbow, having approached so quietly neither officer noticed. "Ma'am, I've been monitoring radio frequencies. I'm picking up weak emergency beacons from the crash sites. They're still alive, but ... double quotes. She left the implication unspoken." Thompson turned to stare out at the storm, watching debris being hurled through the air by winds that seemed almost alive in their malevolence. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of command and the burden of hard choices. "If I authorize this mission, and you don't come back, I'll have to live with sending another pilot to her death." Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "If you don't authorize it, sir, you'll have to live with something worse." The truth of it hung between them like a physical presence. 15 soldiers were counting on rescue that wasn't coming unless someone was willing to fly into conditions that had already claimed 3 aircraft. The storm didn't care about rank or protocol or the politics of favoritism. It only responded to skill, preparation, and the kind of courage that came from knowing exactly what you were risking and choosing to risk it anyway. Thompson was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with a decision that would define him as a commander and as a man. Finally, he straightened, and Rebecca saw the moment when his personal pride gave way to his duty to his soldiers. "What do you need?" he asked. "Just your authorization, sir, and maybe." She paused, then spoke the words that had been building in her chest all day. "Maybe a little faith in the old ways of doing things." Thompson nodded slowly, then moved to the radio console. His voice, when he keyed the microphone, carried the authority of command, but also something new: humility born of hard lessons learned too late. "All stations, this is base. Be advised, we are launching emergency rescue operation. Chief Warrant Officer Hayes, you are cleared for immediate departure." Rebecca felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. Outside, the storm raged with unprecedented fury. waiting to test everything she thought she knew about flying, about courage, and about the bond between pilot and machine that had defined her life since she was old enough to dream of the sky. The breaking point had passed. Now came the test. Rebecca ran through the pre-flight checklist with the methodical precision her father had drilled into her years ago. Each switch, each gauge, each system response was cataloged and verified. The Black Hawk sat steady on the tarmac despite the storm's fury, as if the old aircraft understood what was being asked of it. Sergeant Gonzalez worked alongside her with quiet efficiency, securing equipment and making final adjustments to the emergency rescue gear. Neither woman spoke unnecessarily. They both understood that words were less important now than preparation and focus. "Weather radar is showing clear pockets," Rebecca murmured, studying the instruments her father had installed years ago. Unlike the sleek digital displays of the newer aircraft, these were analog gauges that had been tested in storms across 3 decades of service. "There's a corridor here, following the ridgeline. It'll be rough, but it's flyable." Major Thompson appeared at the aircraft door, rain streaming from his flight jacket. He had to shout to be heard over the wind. "Rebecca, the latest weather reports show conditions are still deteriorating. Are you sure about this?" She looked up from her instruments, and he saw something in her eyes that he'd missed before, not reckless bravery, but calculated confidence, born of preparation and skill. "Sir, this is what my aircraft was designed for. My father flew missions like this in Vietnam, in weather that grounded everything else in the fleet." Thompson nodded, but his face remained etched with concern. "What's your flight plan?" Rebecca pulled out a paper map, not the digital displays used by the newer pilots, but an old-fashioned chart marked with handwritten notations. "I'll follow the valley floor at low altitude, using terrain features to break up the wind patterns. The newer birds tried to fly over the storm. I'm going to fly through it. That sounds incredibly dangerous." "It is, but it's also the only way." She traced a route with her finger, showing him approaches that weren't in any manual. "My father taught me to read the land, not just the instruments. Storms have patterns, and if you know how to read them, you can find the spaces between the chaos." Gonzalez climbed down from the aircraft, giving Rebecca a thumbs up. "All systems green, ma'am. Emergency medical supplies loaded, extra fuel bladders secured." As if to test their resolve, a massive gust of wind slammed into the helicopter, rocking it on its landing gear. Thompson instinctively ducked, but Rebecca simply reached up and adjusted a control setting, compensating for the movement without apparent concern. "Ma'am," Gonzalez said quietly, "I'd like to come with you." Rebecca shook her head. "Maria, this is a single-pilot mission. I need to keep the weight down and the risk limited to, with respect, ma'am, you're going to need help with the wounded. And someone needs to work the rescue hoist while you fly." Gonzalez's voice carried quiet determination. "I've flown with you before. I trust this bird, and I trust you." Thompson watched the exchange, seeing something he'd failed to recognize before, the respect and loyalty that Rebecca had earned through competence and character rather than rank or politics. It was a lesson in leadership that his own arrogance had blinded him to. "Sergeant Gonzalez makes a good point," he said. "You'll need support for medical evacuation." Rebecca considered for a moment, then nodded. "All right, Maria, but understand, this is going to be the worst flying conditions either of us has ever experienced." "I understand, ma'am." As they made final preparations, Rebecca felt a strange calm descend over her. This was what she'd trained for, what her father had prepared her for in long conversations about flying that went beyond the technical aspects to touch on something deeper, the relationship between pilot, machine, and mission that transcended normal understanding. She climbed into the cockpit and began the startup sequence. The Black Hawk's engines coughed to life with a sound that was more growl than roar. different from the smooth whine of the newer aircraft. This was the sound of experience of an aircraft that had learned to adapt and endure. Thompson stepped back as the rotors began to turn, their beats steady and strong despite the storm's interference. Through the rain-streaked windscreen, he could see Rebecca running through her final checks with the methodical precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The radio crackled to life. "Base, this is Rescue 1. Ready for departure." Thompson keyed his microphone, and when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that was different from his earlier commands. This was the voice of a leader who had learned humility. "Rescue 1, you are cleared for immediate departure." God. Speed. The Black Hawk lifted from the tarmac with steady grace, rising into the storm's maw as if it belonged there. Thompson watched until the aircraft disappeared into the gray chaos, then turned back toward the operations center, where radar screens would track their progress and radio operators would listen for updates from the heart of the storm. For the first time since taking command, Major Thompson found himself praying, not for his own reputation or his career, but for the safe return of a pilot whose worth he had finally learned to see. In the storm, Rebecca felt the Black Hawk respond to the wind and rain with the resilience of a creature born to fly in conditions that defeated lesser machines. This was their moment, pilot and aircraft united in purpose, heading into the unknown to bring home those who had fallen. The fight back had begun. The storm embraced Rebecca's Black Hawk like an old enemy greeting a familiar adversary. Wind shear battered the aircraft from all sides, but the veteran helicopter responded to each challenge with the stubborn resilience of a machine that had learned to survive. Rebecca's hands moved over the controls with practiced precision, reading the storm's patterns through instruments and instinct. "Rescue 1, what's your status?" Thompson's voice crackled through the radio, barely audible over the storm's interference. "Entering the valley now," Rebecca replied, her voice calm despite the chaos surrounding her. "Visibility near zero, but the terrain following radar is painting a clear picture." In the back of the aircraft, Sergeant Gonzalez monitored the emergency frequencies, listening for any transmission from the downed crews. Static filled her headset, but underneath the noise, she caught fragments of weak signals. "Ma'am, I'm getting intermittent emergency beacons. Multiple locations, approximately 2 kilometers ahead and slightly west." Rebecca adjusted course, following a route that took them along the valley floor where the wind patterns were slightly more predictable. Unlike the newer pilots who had tried to fly above the storm, she was using the terrain itself as a shield, ducking behind ridges and following natural windbreaks that weren't marked on any official chart. The first crash site appeared through the rain like a ghost materializing from the gray. Morrison's Black Hawk lay on its side in a clearing, its rotor blades twisted and broken, but Rebecca could see movement around the wreck survivors waving frantically at the sound of her approaching aircraft. "Base, this is Rescue 1. I have visual contact with Hawk 7. Survivors confirmed." Thompson's relief was audible even through the static. "Outstanding, Rescue 1. What's your assessment?" Rebecca circled the crash site, studying the terrain and wind patterns with the eye of someone who had learned to read conditions that defeated others. "Landing zone is marginal, but viable. Initiating rescue operations." She brought the Black Hawk down with surgical precision, compensating for wind gusts that would have overwhelmed a less experienced pilot. The landing was harder than normal, but the old aircraft absorbed the impact with the durability that had kept it flying through decades of hard service. Gonzalez was out of the aircraft before the skids had fully settled, running toward the wreck with medical supplies. Rebecca kept the engines running, ready for immediate departure, while monitoring conditions that were continuing to deteriorate. 3 wounded, 2 walking, Gonzalez reported over the intercom. "Captain Morrison has a broken arm and possible concussion, but he's conscious." As they loaded the injured, Rebecca caught Morrison's eye. The pilot who had mocked her aircraft and questioned her abilities looked at her with something approaching awe. "Rebecca, I don't know how you're flying in this." "Experience," she replied simply, then keyed her radio. "Base, first group secure. Moving to second crash site." The second site proved more challenging. Rodriguez's helicopter had gone down on a ridge, and the approach required threading between rock outcroppings and winds that gusted over 90 knots. But Rebecca found the path, using techniques her father had taught her about reading terrain and wind that weren't in any flight manual. "Jesus," Rodriguez breathed as they pulled him aboard, his legs splinted by his crew chief. "We thought we were done for. The storm just ate us alive." Rebecca didn't respond immediately, focused on the delicate process of extracting the Blackhawk from the confined landing zone. Only when they were clear did she key her radio again. "Base, second group recovered. Moving to final site." The Apache crash presented the greatest challenge. Williams had gone down in a narrow canyon where the wind created a Venturi effect, accelerating to speeds that had defeated every rescue attempt by conventional aircraft. But Rebecca's Blackhawk wasn't conventional. It was a machine that had learned to adapt, to find ways through conditions that stopped others. "Rescue 1, be advised. That canyon is a wind tunnel," Thompson warned. "Approach with extreme caution. Copy, base." Beginning approach. Rebecca descended into the canyon. Like a surgeon performing delicate surgery, each control input measured and precise. The wind tried to slam them into the canyon walls, but she rode the turbulence with the skill of someone who had spent years learning to dance with chaos. Captain Williams lay beside his wrecked Apache, his crew chief applying pressure to a serious leg wound. When he saw Rebecca's Blackhawk descending through conditions that had claimed his more advanced aircraft, his expression shifted from desperation to something approaching reverence. "Ow?" he asked as Gonzalez worked to stabilize his injuries. "How are you flying in this?" Rebecca glanced back at him, rain streaming down her flight visor. "Because sometimes the old ways are still the best ways." As they lifted off with the final group of survivors, Rebecca felt the weight of vindication settle over her. Every pilot who had doubted her, every aircraft that had been deemed superior to her battered Blackhawk, every assumption about modern versus experienced, all of it had been tested in the crucible of the storm and found wanting. The radio crackled. With Thompson's voice, and for the first time since she'd known him, it carried genuine respect. "Rescue 1. All personnel accounted for. Outstanding work." Rebecca keyed her microphone as she guided the overloaded Blackhawk through the storm toward home. "Base, this is Rescue 1. Mission accomplished." Behind her, 15 soldiers sat in stunned silence, saved by the pilot and aircraft they had. Dismissed, rescued by the very combination of experience and resilience they had mocked. The storm continued to rage around them, but inside the scarred cabin of the old Blackhawk, they were safe. The downfall of arrogance was complete. What remained was the journey home. The return flight tested every skill Rebecca had ever learned, and some she discovered in the crucible of necessity. The Blackhawk, now carrying 15 souls beyond its normal capacity, fought through the storm with the determination of an aircraft that refused to accept defeat. Every control input was a negotiation with physics. Every mile covered a victory against odds that should have been insurmountable. "Rescue 1, what's your fuel status?" Thompson's voice carried barely concealed anxiety. The radio crackled with static, but his concern was clear. Rebecca glanced at her gauges, making quick calculations that included wind resistance, the extra weight of survivors, and the power required to maintain controlled flight in conditions that were still worsening. "Sufficient for mission completion," she reported, though the margins were tighter than she'd admit. In the cargo bay, Sergeant Gonzalez moved between the wounded with practiced efficiency. monitoring vitals and providing what medical care she could in the chaotic environment. Captain Morrison, despite his injuries, watched Rebecca's flying with the fascination of a professional seeing mastery demonstrated under impossible conditions. "How are you reading the wind patterns?" he asked during a brief moment when the turbulence eased slightly. "Our instruments couldn't track anything in this chaos." Rebecca's voice came back steady and calm. "You have to feel it, not just measure it. The storm has rhythm. If you listen to what the aircraft is telling you, you can find the spaces between the chaos." As if to emphasize her point, a massive downdraft grabbed the Black Hawk and tried to slam it toward the valley floor. But Rebecca was already compensating, her input smooth and precise, dancing with forces that had defeated the newer, more technologically advanced aircraft. Lieutenant Rodriguez, his leg immobilized but his mind clear, shook his head in amazement. "We trained on simulators that couldn't replicate conditions like this. How did you learn to fly in weather that doesn't exist in any training program?" "From my father," Rebecca replied simply, "and from this aircraft. Every scar on this bird is a lesson learned. Every repair, a solution to a problem that would have destroyed a less experienced machine." The radio crackled with an updated weather report that made everyone in the aircraft tense. "Rescue 1, be advised. Conditions at base are now at maximum operational limits. Visibility is less than a quarter mile, with gusting crosswinds at the landing zone." Rebecca absorbed the information without visible concern. "Copy, base. Request emergency lighting and ground guidance." "Already standing by," Thompson replied. "All non-essential personnel have been cleared from the flight line." Through the storm-darkened sky, the lights of the base began to appear, not the clear beacons they would normally present, but dim glows filtered through sheets of rain and blowing debris. The landing approach would be the final test, the moment when all her skill and the aircraft's resilience would either prove sufficient or fail catastrophically. "Base, this is Rescue 1 beginning final approach," Rebecca announced. "I'm going to need everyone to trust me on this one." The Black Hawk descended through the maelstrom like a creature returning to its natural element. Wind shear buffeted the aircraft from all directions, but Rebecca's hands moved with the certainty of someone who had learned to read the storm's language. In the cargo bay, wounded soldiers who had given up hope watched in silent awe as their rescuer performed what seemed impossible. Captain Williams, despite his pain, found himself studying Rebecca's technique with professional fascination. "She's not fighting the wind," he murmured to Gonzalez. "She's using it." The observation was accurate. Where other pilots had tried to overpower the storm, Rebecca was working with it, finding the brief moments of relative calm between gusts, using the aircraft's momentum to carry them through the worst turbulence. It was flying elevated to an art form, technique refined by years of experience with an aircraft that demanded skill rather than relying on automated systems. 50 feet, Rebecca called out calmly. 40.30. A massive crosswind gust tried to push them off the runway approach, but she was already compensating, the Black Hawk responding to her touch like a partner in an intricate dance. The landing lights appeared through the rain, marking the boundaries of safety in a world gone chaotic. 20 feet. 10. The touchdown was harder than normal. No pilot could make a gentle landing in these conditions, but it was controlled, precise, and safe. The Black Hawk's landing gear absorbed the impact with the stoic endurance of a machine built to survive, not merely to perform. As the rotors wound down, the cargo bay filled with an almost religious silence. 15 men who had faced death in the storm sat in the cabin of an aircraft they had dismissed, saved by a pilot they had underestimated. The moment held weight beyond words, a reckoning not just with the storm, but with assumptions and prejudices that had nearly cost lives. Thompson was the first to reach the aircraft, running through the rain with a medical team close behind. When he saw Rebecca climbing down from the cockpit, her flight suit soaked but her bearings steady and professional, he stopped short. "Rebecca," he said, and his voice carried a weight of emotion that went beyond relief. "I owe you an apology." "I owe everyone an apology." She looked at him with eyes that held no anger, only the quiet satisfaction of a job completed under impossible circumstances. "Sir, apologies can wait. Right now, let's get these men the medical attention they need." But even as the medical teams took over, as stretchers were brought and the wounded were carefully evacuated from the aircraft, the significance of what had happened settled over everyone present. The storm still raged around them, but within the circle of base lights, a different kind of storm had ended, one made of pride, prejudice, and the dangerous assumption that newer was always better. Captain Morrison, his arm in a makeshift sling, paused beside Rebecca before being helped toward the medical tent. "That Black Hawk of yours," he said quietly. "It's not a relic, is it?" Rebecca ran her hand along the scarred fuselage of her aircraft, feeling the metal still warm from the storm's fury. "No," she replied. "It's a survivor, just like we all are now." The big climax was complete. In the space of one impossible flight, everything had changed, not just who was seen as capable, but how capability itself was measured. The storm had been the judge, and its verdict was written in the 15 lives that now breathed safely, because courage and skill had proven more valuable than politics and prejudice. 3 days after the storm, the base had returned to something resembling normal operations. The damaged aircraft were being assessed for repair or replacement, and the wounded were recovering in field hospitals or being evacuated to better medical facilities. But the real changes were less visible and more profound shifts in attitude and understanding that would reshape how the squadron operated going forward. Rebecca sat in the maintenance hangar, watching Sergeant Gonzalez and her team conduct a thorough post-flight inspection of the Black Hawk. The aircraft bore new scars from the storm's small dents from hail, scratches from debris, and stress marks from the extraordinary demands placed on its aging airframe. But it had brought everyone home, and that was what mattered. Structural integrity is still solid, Gonzalez reported, running her hands along the rotor hub with the reverence of someone who had witnessed a miracle. "A few minor repairs needed, but this bird is ready to fly again whenever you are." Major Thompson approached the aircraft with a different bearing than he'd carried before the storm. The swagger was gone, replaced by something more substantial, the humility that came from having one's assumptions shattered by reality. "Rebecca, do you have a minute?" She looked up from the maintenance log she'd been reviewing. "Yes, sir." Thompson gestured toward a quiet corner of the hangar, away from the bustle of ongoing work. When they were alone, he took a breath that seemed to cost him something. "I've submitted my report on the mission," he said. "I've recommended you for the Distinguished Flying Cross, and I've requested that this incident be used as a case study for storm weather rescue operations." Rebecca nodded but didn't respond immediately. She'd learned to be cautious about praise from Thompson. "I've also requested a transfer," he continued, his voice quieter now. "Not because I'm running from what happened, but because I think this squadron needs a different kind of leadership. Someone who understands that experience and wisdom don't always come in the newest package." This surprised her. "Sir, that's not necessary. What matters is that we learn from." Thompson held up a hand. "Rebecca, I nearly got 15 people killed because I let my ego override good judgment. That's not a mistake a commander gets to make twice." He paused, looking out at the flight line where her battered Black Hawk sat among the newer aircraft. "Your father would be proud of what you did out there." The mention of her father hit deeper than any formal recognition could have. Rebecca felt the weight of legacy, of lessons passed down through generations of pilots who understood that flying was more than technology. It was about the bond between human skill and mechanical reliability forged in the crucible of real-world challenges. Thank you, sir. Over the following weeks, the changes became more apparent. The newer pilots began seeking out Rebecca's advice on weather flying and emergency procedures. Captain Morrison, his arm healed but his perspective permanently altered, started studying the older techniques that had saved his life. Lieutenant Rodriguez requested to be assigned to fly with Rebecca as her co-pilot, eager to learn from someone who had demonstrated mastery under conditions that had humbled him. The Black Hawk itself became something of a legend on the base. Maintenance crews took extra pride in caring for the aircraft that had accomplished the impossible. New pilots arriving at the squadron were told its story as part of their orientation, not as a tale of technological triumph, but as a reminder that in aviation, experience and skill trumped specifications and assumptions. 6 months later, Rebecca stood beside her aircraft as a new class of pilots gathered for advanced weather training. The program had been developed based on lessons learned from the storm rescue, incorporating techniques that had been nearly lost in the rush toward technological solutions. Flying in extreme weather isn't about overpowering the storm, she told the assembled pilots. It's about understanding it, working with it, and trusting in the partnership between pilot and aircraft that goes beyond what any manual can teach. One of the new pilots, a young lieutenant named Carter, raised his hand. "Ma'am, how do you develop that kind of partnership with an aircraft?" Rebecca smiled, running her hand along the familiar scarred metal of her Black Hawk's fuselage. "Time, patience, and respect. This aircraft has been my teacher as much as my tool. Every flight, every challenge, every storm has been a lesson in what's possible when you refuse to give up." As the training session continued, Rebecca reflected on how much had changed since that night when the storm had tested everything she believed about flying, about leadership, and about the value of persistence in the face of doubt. The base still operated much as it had before, but the culture had shifted. Experience was valued alongside innovation, and judgment was measured by results rather than assumptions. The old Black Hawk continued to fly, its battered exterior hiding systems and capabilities that newer aircraft struggled to match. But more importantly, it flew with a pilot who had proven that sometimes the old ways weren't just better, they were essential. As the sun set over the base, casting long shadows across the flight line, Rebecca walked toward her quarters with the satisfaction that came from a job well done and lessons well learned. Behind her, the Black Hawk sat ready for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, a testament to the enduring truth that in aviation, as in life, character and competence mattered more than appearance and politics. The storm had passed, but its lessons would endure. And in the quiet hangar where experience was valued over ego, where skill was respected more than rank, Rebecca Hayes had found her place, not as the pilot they had overlooked, but as the aviator they had learned to trust when everything else failed. Sometimes the best revenge wasn't getting even. It was proving that being right was more powerful than being popular, and that when lives hung in the balance, substance would always triumph over style. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.